class can have more than one constructor. This is a primary constructor up top here. We can also have a secondary constructor. To create a secondary constructor, use the constructor keyword, and then you want to pass in some additional values. But first, let's get that set up. Let's assume that this user can be of a particular type. And so we'll say is platinum. And this would be perhaps a platinum user for a particular, you could say it's a financial institution. And so we want to create another constructor. So sometimes we want to be able to provide, instead of the first name and the last name, we already know by default they're not platinum. So what we can do is we can call this constructor here. Now, this constructor will take the first and last name, but then what we need to do is call into the original version. So we're going to say the first name, I'm going to pass it in. So this first name value is coming from here, and then the last name. And then we'll say is platinum, we can say false. Now what you're going to see here is we no longer have any red squigglies. What this means is I can use this new constructor. Now I don't have to provide a body for this here, but if I would like to, I can also provide a body. Maybe I want to do something in here like print line. I could say is platinum is false by default. So if I use this one, if I use this constructor, this line of code will get run. So let's go back to our example and let's change this one here. So by default, both of these are going to call into this here. Now, of course, we have not provided a last name, so let's provide a last name here. And that's going to be Felker. And then we'll say is platinum is true. Now I'm a platinum user, but this user down here is not a platinum user. So now if we were to run this, on the second call down here, we're going to see is platinum is false by default. That's because when we go here, I go to the implementation, it's using this secondary constructor. Now we can even go even further and say if we want another constructor, so multiple constructors, you can keep going to here. So I might say first name, and then I might just skip that and say, all right, this, which means, hey, call another one of these instructors. And this one is going to call in first name, and this time I don't know what the last name is going to do. So I'm going to call unknown. And perhaps just for completion's sake, we'll say, hey, in the third constructor. Now if I go back to the screen here, and let's go ahead and create another one. var, let's say it's your cousin, and we'll say to user, and we'll say first name is, Nick. And then what we'll say, we're not going to do anything here because if we look at this implementation, it's using the third constructor here, which is going to say, hey, I'm in the third constructor. But look, something else is going to happen. And what's going to happen is when this third constructor is called, the word Nick is going to be put into the first name, and then it's going to call into this. It's going to pass this first name value into this, and it's going to give an unknown last name. Now, this is actually going to call this constructor, which is going to say, boom, all right, now it's unknown, and then it's going to print is platinum by default. So let's actually see that run, and then all the values, of course, are then passed into the root constructor here, and then we can actually see everything. So if we run this now, what you'll notice is something interesting is going to happen here. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on here, so let's clean this up a bit. So let's go ahead and just kind of get rid of all this stuff here. We just want to see when one of the constructors is called, and so we have those methods inside of there that's going to call print line when a constructor is called. So if we run it now, we'll see is platinum is false by default. And we see the same thing again, and then I'm in a third constructor. So if we were to go to this first one here, this first one uses the primary constructor. Nothing happens here. We just set up an object, and that's the end. The second one uses a constructor here that uses the first name and the last name, and then defaults the platinum field to false, and it says is platinum is false by default. Now the third one is interesting, because the third one we say, hey, the first name is Nick, and then it calls into the other constructor here. So it's, hey, the first name is Nick, last name is unknown, and then what happens is this constructor will call into the root constructor. So it's going to go, this executes first, this line, then this line is going to execute, which calls in up to the primary constructor. After that is complete, which is this line here, which calls the primary constructor up here, then it will procedurally call this one. And then now that this whole method is done running, which is right here, then it will run this. So what we're seeing here is this is being called first because, again, this gets called, which goes into here. Nothing happens up here. That's complete. Then it runs this, whatever's in this constructor. which is this call here. It says, okay, that's done now. Now run finally what's in your constructor. And so these three things are happening. So if we really want to make it simple, let's go ahead and say, so third, just to really make it kind of obvious, second, and there we go. I'm going to go back and we're going to just comment out this one. And what that'll do is we're just going to run this one here and we see second, then third. So first thing that happened is it printed second because it hit this constructor first from kind of walking this call chain. And then it went to the third one. Now we could actually get around this here and say, hey, this one here, we'll just say is platinum is false. And we could even say true if we want to, doesn't really matter. But let's just leave it false for, let's do it true actually. So if we call this and we pass in a first name, we'll give it an unknown last name and they're a platinum user. Now when we run this, you're just going to see third being printed to the screen because it's only calling the third instructor, because by default, what happens is this constructor will be instantiated. In turn, it takes its first name value and calls the primary constructor. So this right here is the primary constructor because it has 3 parameters. If we then took this, this one out, last one, it's now going to call the second constructor. So let's assume this wasn't here, so let's comment it out. That's not going to run. Now you'll see that we don't have a constructor that matches this signature, which is a string and another string. We have a constructor with 2 strings and a Boolean. So that's why we're seeing multiple different versions here. And again, if we can come in here, this time we run it, we're going to see second and then third. Now you can have multiple different constructors inside of here. So you can keep creating different types of constructors. You could set them to platinum, etc. Now, of course, some of these things may not even need to happen. So we can say, hey, perhaps we don't even need this. We can use some default parameters here as well. So if the last name is not known, let's use unknown. And then if it's, by default, we're going to set this to false. So now if I come back here, I can still do this exact same thing. Even this would work. And it's still going to work because it's using default parameters and the named arguments, the default argument values. And so then we can see everything how it should be. So each of the objects is going to be created, memory is going to be allocated, etc. And then we kind of get all that safety right here and the various different constructors. However, if you do need different constructors for whatever reason, or you need to perform some type of different values, you can call different functions, do different, run all different types of code in here and run different code in here, you can do that. Just provide a different constructor using the constructor keyword and you're off to the races. Now, additionally, you can also restrict some of the constructors using modifiers such as protected, or you could call internal, etc. So you can actually lock down who can call into a constructor based upon a modifier.